Hey students, Mr. McCoy here. As you know, I'm a weird guy. My whole life, everything I see in terms of patterns and mathematics. I try to make sense of our complex world by reducing things to simple systems and equations. So now coronavirus comes around, and I'm constantly hearing the news talking about chances of infection, rate of spread, closing borders, and social distancing in order to flatten the curve. These are all just equations, and this situation is perfect for a coding challenge. I decided to make a virus simulator with Java using processing IDE to help with the graphical elements. And here's what I have so far. Move this out of the way for a moment. So in processing, you build classes just like you would any other Java IDE. I've got the main program, my runner class, call it COVID for obvious reasons. And then this is an object-oriented program where I have people who may or may not be infected, and a bunch of people could make up a community, and various communities could make up a world. So I'd like to talk about these first three variables here in my program. Bring the program over here. Frames in a day is just a variable that I use to speed up or slow down the simulation. It's basically how many frames are there displayed to the screen in one day. If I reduce that down to a very small number, 1, then we're running at 30 frames per second. So that means that we will have 30 different days represented a second. And that's just insane. We won't be able to see what's going on. Or if I set this very high, so every day will take approximately 10 seconds. I'm going to keep this at 30 for now so that every day lasts approximately 1 second. Next up, we have the number of communities. In this simulation, there's just one community, and the total population is 3,000. So there's 3,000 different people in this community. If I hold my mouse over a community, then I get some information displayed up here. The name of the community, its population, its density, population density, and what percentage of the population is currently infected. Let me get a fresh simulation started. All right, I'm going to press space, and patient 0 was created right there, that little red dot. And I have the simulation paused right now, but as soon as I unpause it, you're going to see the infection begin to spread. And it only took a week for the virus to spread throughout this entire community. So what influenced the behavior of that? Well, I have a spread ratio variable, and let's take a look at that for a moment. Right now it is set to 15%. What that means is that if you take the diameter of the community and you take 15% of that diameter, then that's the effective radius of any contagious member of society. They can spread it to a distance of 15% of the diameter of the community. If I change that value up to something much larger, let's go to 50%. So there's patient 0. 50% of the diameter of the community. So this person right here can infect people almost all the way across the community. And so we'll jump into, there we go, this is day 1. Look at how far that person was able to spread. That one person right over here got this person over here sick because the spread ratio is just so large. But notice that not everyone within that spread ratio got sick. That's because of this variable right here called chance of infection. It's currently set to 15%, which means that that patient 0 that was right there in the middle, all of these people were within that spread ratio, but only 15% of them actually contracted the virus. Let's check out what happens when we change that. Let me put the spread ratio back to its original value and change the chance of infection to something much more devastating. Instead of 15%, 100%. All right, so where is patient 0? That's patient 0 right there. So the spread ratio is back down to 15% of the diameter. So it's going to be a much smaller spread ratio, but every single person that's within that ratio is now guaranteed to become infected. And let me play this out. So nobody was spared if they were within that spread ratio of an infected person. I'm going to set that chance of infection back down to 15% like it was a second ago. And now let's play around with the number of communities. I'm going to kick this up to 6 communities. All right, and there we have 6 communities, and I also programmed it so that if I press the R key, I can get a new randomly generated situation. You'll see that the placement of the communities in the world changes, and also the size of each community changes a little bit as well. And if I press space, we have patient 0 over here, and the virus spreads throughout that community pretty quickly. All right, so we've reached 100% within that community, but only 15% of the entire population. Why? Well, because the community was not interacting with any other communities. None of the infected people ever moved to any other community, and therefore they were safe. But that's not very realistic. In the real world, people do travel between communities. I don't know what exactly these communities represent. Are they each individual countries? Are they different states within America? Are they different schools within Frisco ISD? I don't know. You can kind of play with the numbers and make it whatever you want it to be. But the truth is, no one is ever 100% isolated from the rest of their world. People travel around. So we have this variable right here, chance of travel. If I set that to be a very high number, like 50%, then you see some true insanity. This is every day, 50% of the people decide to go to a different community. Pretty insane how much movement that is. That's not very realistic either. So let's keep that pretty small. Most people don't move around that much outside of their own community. So I'm setting this at 0.5%. So 1% of the population every day will decide to travel to another community. You can see them darting across. But another thing that's kind of unrealistic about these communities is that they are all currently the same population density. Every community has the exact same radius and approximately the same number of people in there. Every one of these communities has about 500 people in it. So I added in this variable right here, evenly distribute. When it's true, every community will have approximately an even distribution of the total population. If I set this to false, then you'll see quite a bit of difference. This right here has a very low population density. Here's a medium population density, and here is a high population density. High population density here, about 800 people, whereas the low one, about 80 people. So it's about 10 times more people in a high population density area. And those are randomly determined as well. Another thing that I considered is whenever people travel, if 1% of the people are traveling on a daily basis, if they were just randomly determining where they wanted to travel, then eventually I could just sit here and the communities would reach an equilibrium where they all have the same number of people if each person was traveling to a random community. I adjusted it so that a traveler is more likely to travel to a dense population area. So this person over here, if she decides to travel, she is about 10 times more likely to decide to go to this city than to go out into the country. I assume there's just more to see over here, more of her friends are over here, there's little to do out here, and that's why very few people decided to populate that community. Let's play out this scenario right here. So I created patient 0, and you can see the little red dot right here. And that patient 0 is in a high population density area, so you can expect that it'll spread very quickly here. And then as soon as people start traveling outside of this area, if they are infected, they can easily infect other areas. So let's play this out. All right, we're already sending out infected people to other communities. Ground 0 is already 100% infected. All areas now see some level of infection. And what you'll see is the high population density areas quickly hit 100%, whereas a low population density area it took much longer. Virus needs hosts in order to spread, and there are fewer hosts here, fewer people going into that area. But there we are, only a few weeks in, and we've reached 100% in all communities. What we've seen so far is pretty devastating. All of our communities hit 100%, and the only way to prevent that is to not allow any travel whatsoever, and that's not very realistic to a real world. So I wanted to implement some additional variables to help us figure out how can we put the brakes on something like this and slow the spread and protect certain communities, and then also like just some additional real world variables. So idea number one of what to do moving forward is having a quarantine delay. Right now, whenever people get sick, they just get sick, they stay sick, and they spread their sickness to everyone. But what if, after a certain number of days, a person realized that they were sick and they took themselves out of the normal population? They put themselves in quarantine and therefore they couldn't spread it anymore. Now, it might take a day or two for them to realize that they're sick, so they can still spread the virus during those couple days. So that's what this variable will eventually be. Maybe after 2 or 3 days, they realize that they're symptomatic and they put themselves into quarantine. I know this is a little dark, but I was thinking about implementing a mortality rate. Currently, we just state that we have infected people and not yet infected people. But what if infected people sometimes died and sometimes got cured? Then these two variables would implement that. Recovery time would be how long does it take for the virus to either kill you or for you to recover from it? So if this variable was 7, then that would mean a week after you got the virus, you would either be recovered or you would have died, and that would depend on the mortality rate. So I could set the mortality rate at, like, say, 2% and the recovery time at 7. This would mean that a week after you get the virus, 2% of the people who got the virus would die, whereas 98% of them would just be recovered and, I suppose, immune to receiving it again. And then another variable I was thinking about putting in would be restricting travel. The purpose of this variable, once I get it working, is that perhaps Community A wants to stop letting in visitors from Community B if Community B has more than a certain threshold, a certain percentage of their population infected. So let's say if 5% of Community B has the virus, then Community A should not allow travel from them. Then I was thinking, what good is data if I'm not really analyzing that data? So I've added functionality that it will export each day. The percentage of infected people within the world is exported into a file, and then we can load that data into a Google spreadsheet to take a look at it and see what kind of information we can get from that data. So let's start off by going back to a simple situation. Here's what that situation looks like. Yeah, people are still allowed to travel, but there's only one community. So what that ends up being is that a person over here, if they decide to travel, will just quickly dart over here. So they're just traveling within their own community. So I'm going to let this play out all the way to a 100% infection. We had another spread happen over here and over here because of people traveling to the other side of this community. Another one down here. So traveling most definitely does increase the spread. And there we go, only 18 days in and we reached 100%. So every single simulation I've been running has been exporting to a log file. And so this is that the test that we just ran. And I can put that into a Google spreadsheet that I had already prepared. And then we can take a look at the data. At the bottom, we see the days. And the red line indicates what percentage of the population was infected at any given period of time. It's pretty much what you'd expect in that we have an exponential growth. The total percentage of infected people is growing exponentially, But then once we reach this right here, 50%, this is the 50% infected mark right here. Once we reach that, we're still increasing very rapidly, but the rate at which we're increasing starts to drop off and becomes slower and slower growth until finally we reach 100%. So you get this nice exponential growth followed by this exponential decay, I want to call it, uh, which you might expect it to continue with exponential growth up this way, but it starts to slow down just because the virus is running out of people to infect, and the people we're trying to infect are way off into the corner, and it just takes it's harder to get a hold of them. The black bar step chart in the background tells us how many new infections in terms of total population percentage came in on any given day. So you can see right here on day 12, this was a particularly devastating day. Day 12, we had 14% of the population started day 12 healthy, but then got the virus at some point that day. That's a huge jump. So here on day 11, 52% of the population had the virus. And then this jump right here of 14% took us to a total of 66.9% of the total population having the virus at that point. I'm going to throw in a bunch of other data here and do a different simulation. Let's take a look at 20 different communities with 3,000 people. Spread ratio of 10%, chance of infection only 5%. I'm decreasing this quite a bit. 0.5% of the people will decide to travel on a daily basis. We are not evenly distributing, so we will have dense communities and sparse communities. But then let's also let this play out faster by changing the frames in a day down to 10. So that'll just speed it up so we don't have to watch quite as long. Just going to keep hitting R to get random rerolls until I find something that I like. This looks pretty good. We have our low population density areas and our high population density areas. There's patient 0. Patient 0 traveled before infecting anyone. That's kind of interesting. So now that patient 0 is in a low population density area, we might actually be off to a very slow start in this simulation. All right, our second person is infected, and our third person. Fourth. And someone just traveled into a high population density area and down here into this high population area. So we're going to see a much faster growth now. Yeah, it's just exploding now. It looks like the couple of low density areas that we have around here are going to be the safest place to be right now. Fewer travelers coming in. They kind of social distance by nature just because they don't have a whole lot of very close neighbors. But at this point, none of the communities are without infection. %98 of the total population now infected. The only holdouts right now are in those low population density areas. I'm going to go ahead and call it right here. It might take another month or so before every single person becomes infected in those low pop density areas. But we'll go ahead and take a look at this data because that's practically 100% right there. So here's our log file. Copy the data into Google and take a look at what we got. All right, so again, you see the red curve. It starts off very, very slowly, and then boom, travel starts to happen. exponential growth. Once we hit the 50% of the world's population infected, that growth, still extreme, but starts to slow down and slowly eases its way into about 100% infected. Our worst day on record here was day 107, where 3.6% of the total population woke up healthy, but then contracted the virus. You'll see all these spikes that we see here, and my interpretation of those spikes, I think that means that there was travel of an infected person into a new community, and that's where we see this big amount of growth followed by less people over time, because that entire community became infected, and then we had to wait for other communities to get the infection. So I didn't do any of this to scare anyone. I don't want you freaking out and saying, "Oh no, it's the end of the world. It's guaranteed 100% infection," because there's so much of this other stuff that I haven't put into place yet. Restricting travel, the fact that people do recover from this and are not able to spread it anymore after a certain amount of time. Right now, we just kind of say that once you're infected, you're always infected and you're always capable of spreading it. So this is very extreme at this point in time. So adding in these extra features will make this a little bit more realistic. And I'm very curious to see how effective this right here is. If we stop going to other communities and we stop allowing people from other communities to come to us, that's basically the entire idea of social distancing. Just like don't be around other people as much as possible, then how much of this can we contain? I'll make all of these files available to you. Check the description below for a link to the Dropbox. Feel free to implement these additional features and play around with the simulation yourself. Keep in mind that none of the numbers that I put into any of these simulations are all that accurate in terms of the real global situation or the real situation here in Frisco. I don't really know what those numbers look like or how well my simulation actually reproduces those situations. So this is really just an experiment of looking at exponential growth. Take it with a grain of salt, not trying to make any kind of political statement here or scare anybody. Just taking what is happening in the real world right now and seeing if I can grow as a coder and maybe make some sense of what I'm seeing around me.